So The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword came out in 2011, and it was met with kind of middling acclaim. And I was kind of filled with trepidation going into this game because I had kind of heard mixed things about it, and it wasn't a game I would probably have played if it weren't for this video series. But I'm really glad I did play it because it turned out to be one of my favorite games in the series. I haven't liked a lot of the more modern Zelda games. I'm not a huge fan of Wind Waker, I'm not a huge fan of Twilight Princess, but Skyward Sword made me remember why I like the Zelda games so much. And I think a large part of that has to do with how it messes with things that we have come to take for granted. It is the introduction of motion controls, which was a huge, felt like a huge controversy at the time because instead of just pressing a button to swing your sword, you are swinging the Wiimote like a sword. And this whole system lives or dies by how accurate it is to your movements or how effective it is at translating your movements into what you would want the character to do on screen. It is not a perfect system. It'll mess up. You'll be pointing the wrong way. You won't swing when you want to. You'll do a spin when you don't want to. But for the most part, for 90% of the game, I had no problem with it. And it actually opens up a lot of really cool gameplay options. It opens up new ways to deal with new enemies or enemies that you've dealt with in previous games that you can now deal with in new and interesting ways. It also introduces a stamina system, which I think is maybe not the smartest, but the most interesting change that this game brings to the series, because in previous games, I know like in Ocarina of Time, if you want to get it across the field, you just roll. And it's really stupid, because it looks stupid, it sounds stupid, it doesn't make any sense, but that's the fastest way to get there, so you just go over and over again across this field. In this game, you can hold down the A button and Link will actually run, he'll sprint. And this is managed by a little meter on the screen that empties as you're doing that, and then if you stop running, it'll start to fill up again. If you stop moving, it'll fill up faster. There's also little fruit in the environment. If you pick one up, you instantly fill that meter. So it introduces on a moment-to-moment basis this kind of risk-reward system that actually makes the process of moving around a lot more enjoyable, because it's something you actually have to think about. It makes it feel fresh. You also have other improvements. There's a shield bash you can do by moving the nunchuck forward quickly. You can use this to parry attacks. This is a really cool system, it's fun to use. And there's all kinds of new improvements, like the precision aiming is really good with the Wiimote. You can just kind of fire off arrows, slingshots. That all feels really good. That's kind of the pinnacle of those systems, I think. I don't know how you could improve on those without radically changing how that works, because at this point, it's very easy to just take out the bow, aim in where you want it, and shoot it. The final main big change they made is that you can actually use your sword as a dowsing rod to point to objectives, or side objectives, or collectibles, and that's really cool actually, because what it does is it turns fetch quests and kind of the grind of playing Zelda, it makes that much quicker, it makes it easier, because you're not left wondering where you should go, you're only left wondering how you can get there, how to solve the puzzle. So, Skyward Sword starts in Skyloft, the floating island, and you are of course Link. But what this game does, and it makes it so much more interesting from the get-go, is it kind of begins in media res in a way that other games haven't. Like, if I may compare to Twilight Princess, which I thought had a terrible first couple hours, this game is so much better about giving you objectives, giving you characters you care about, introducing its world, and getting you into the action where you feel like you're actually making a difference. In Twilight Princess, you spend a lot of time herding rams for no reason. In this game, you are trying to achieve something. You're basically in the school to become a knight, because everyone in this society flies these birds called loftwings. And each person has a loftwing that is like connected to them, and there's these knights that fly around and protect people. You want to be one of those. And there's a ceremony where if you kind of graduate top of your class, you get to participate in the ceremony with Zelda. Speaking of which, I love what they've done with Zelda's character. They've made her more human, they've made her more relatable. They've also made Link kind of uglier. I really like the Link design. He kind of has like puffy lips, and he kind of looks like a normal person, which is, I think, a really nice change. And there's this relationship between these two characters that you can kind of feel and see, and it's inherent in these first couple hours. And it doesn't feel forced. It feels like they're a couple of teenagers who kind of dig each other, and they're in high school. And it's a nice change of pace for the series, because like in Twilight Princess, Zelda was like the stoic figure that you basically, like, she was not a character, she was like an ideal or something. Not so in Skyward Sword. You also have Groose, who is kind of your rival, and he's actually a great character. I love Groose. He's got his own musical theme. He's kind of irreverent, and they do things with his character later on in the game that make him so he's not just this stereotypical, like, you know, the Biff Tannen of Skyward Sword. But anyway, all that happens, and you, of course, get to participate in the ceremony, and then you get the sailcloth, which is a new introduction in this game. It's not that exciting. You just kind of use it so when you're falling, you don't take damage. And usually I would hit the wrong button, so I would take damage anyway. So, kind of a waste of time. But as long as I'm talking about it, the direction on these cutscenes is much more lively and spirited than it has been in the past. There's a lot of character animation to convey emotion. It's kind of funny. It's fun to watch. It's got kind of a Saturday morning cartoon feel to it. One of the problems I do have with the cutscenes, though, is that, and this is something that's been a part of the series for a long time, but is Link mute? Does he talk? Because, like, sometimes he talks, but sometimes he just kind of gestures, and people are like, okay, Link, I get what you're saying. Because this game has a thing where you can do, like, a dialogue tree where it's like, hey, do you want to help me? And then on one side it's like, oh, sure, why not? And the other side it's like, of course. And, like, there's no no, but you can kind of choose. So I guess Link is talking to these people, but you never hear him speak. You never even see like a text box come out of him. He just kind of sits there, and then they're like, oh, I see, I understand. It's weird, because they're making Link more of a character. They're making him a character in this world, but he doesn't fit in with the world because everyone else is talking, and he's not. It's odd. It's really odd. I don't think Link should talk, for the record. I guess the last thing I want to talk about in this intro section is that this game introduces a concept of destiny that is so foreign in today's gaming language. You have all these open world games where it's like, you can create your own destiny. You are here. This world is your playbox. Do what you want. This game is very much the opposite. This is a very old style of... This is an old conception of destiny, where you are destined to do something. And this is the tale of how you accomplish that. And they actually do something very interesting with this concept later in the game that I'll talk about. But for now, it was just kind of this odd reminder that the Zelda games are not like other games these days. So after the ceremony, Zelda gets tossed into a tornado, and you gotta go save her, of course, because that's what you do in Zelda games. You get the Zelda suit. The Zelda suit. You get the Link suit. This is kind of the first introduction to the suit, you know, canonically within the timeline, so that's really cool, because it's like, it's just the knight outfit they have in Skyloft, but here it's kind of the becoming the outfit of Link throughout the series. That's really cool. You get a sword, and within the sword is your companion through the game, Fi. This was one of the big worrying points I had going into this game, was that Fi was going to be condescending and talk you through all the puzzles, because that was kind of the impression I had gotten. That's not really the case at all. I never really ran into that in dungeons where she would tell me how to solve something. I actually went to her a couple times because I was, you know, stuck on something, and the way her phrasing works, it's actually very helpful without making you feel like an idiot. She doesn't do the hey listen thing all the time, which is cool. And I love the design on Fi. She's like an embodiment of your sword. So she doesn't have arms or anything, she just kind of resembles the Master Sword. It's just a really cool kind of permutation on the Navi tattle type thing. So then you descend, and you are on terra firma for the first time, and this is where the first real taste of combat comes into the game. This beginning is rough, because there are things about the combat in this game that you learn through experience that make combat easier and more fun that you don't really have a taste of here. So when you come up to an enemy, they can block your attack. So if you go left to right, they will block on the left and block you. And you'll switch up and you'll come from a different direction, they'll block that. And it feels very random. It doesn't feel like you are outsmarting an enemy, it just kind of feels like they're blocking whatever you throw at them. And it feels unfair. And there are ways around that you come up with. You can throw enemies off balance, you can parry their attacks, you can kind of swing your sword in such a way that it registers as a different hit. There are things that you can do to make combat more fluid. These concepts aren't introduced to you very well. And so the beginning sections of this game, the combat is not fun, and it seems to betray all the promise of the motion controls. But it gets better, the enemies become more interesting. This is just kind of a taste, and it's kind of a bad first taste. There's also a Goron in this area, which is kind of an odd thing because all the other Zelda touchstones are so different, since this takes place prior to everything else. I guess they did this because they wanted a familiar face in this otherworldly setting, and it works. It's always fun to see them because you can go up and talk to them. They're like, "Hey, Link, how's it going?" Blah 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 blah. And there's these goddess cubes, which are a really cool take on, like, I guess, chess. You just hit them with your Skyward Strike, which is where you raise your sword into the air and it charges, and then you shoot it, which is a nice little callback to the first Legend of Zelda. Anyway, and then they shoot off into the sky, and then you can go get them later. Anyway, this is also kind of where you start to fly more, and the flying is really bad in this game. It suffers from the same thing Wind Waker did, which was there are not enough landmarks in the area you're traveling through to make it feel like you're going at any kind of speed. If all you have on screen is a bunch of rocks in the distance, and they just kind of gradually get closer and closer to you, it never feels like you're making any progress, and it never feels exciting. It just feels like a chore. Anytime I had to go anywhere in this game, I was just like, ugh, I have to go through this crap again. You do have a little speed boost that comes back, kind of like Epona's carrots, but it doesn't feel like you're actually making yourself go any faster. But I still did it because it goes whoosh. At this point in the game, you are basically looking for Zelda. That is your motivation for going through these dungeons, these areas. It's kind of a weak motivation. I mean, I know Zelda's an important character, but it just kind of feels like you're tailing her across this world, and you're always there too late, and she's always at the next place. The first area is this forest. This feels like the first level in a video game, you know? It's like a nice little forest. It's got these little kiwi guys. They're like little kiwi tree men. They're really cute. I like them a lot. There's a really big one. There's rope swinging, which uses the motion controls, and it actually feels really good because you kind of pull back on the Wiimote to make yourself go backwards, and you push forward, makes yourself swing forward. It's a nice, natural incorporation of motion controls into the system that's been in every video game ever. You can also cut down trees, which is really cool. You feel like a ninja. Feels like you're cutting down bamboo. This is also where you kind of get a taste for item collecting, which is very flawed, because every time you start up the game, if you pick up one of these, like, crafting materials, it has to pop up the thing where it's like, this is a blah 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 blah, and then it has to show you the screen where it's got all your inventory. Every time after that you collect it, it'll just do the little thing where it pops over your head and then it's in your inventory until you start the game over, and then you have to go through it again. It just feels completely unnecessary. And finally, there is tightrope walking in this area, which is just, it doesn't need to be in video games anymore. All it does is slow you down, and you just kind of walk slowly across this tightrope, and you have to use the motion controls to keep yourself from falling off. And nothing about this is fun. It's never been fun in any game that ever had tightrope walking in it. It's just a complete waste of time. I don't know why they keep doing it. Stop putting... Please don't put that in any games, please. Okay, and then that's the first dungeon, the forest dungeon. This is a good first Zelda dungeon, I think. It's got new enemies you haven't seen before. It's got the Skulltulas, and these are kind of one of the examples of how the motion controlled combat starts to evolve a little bit and get more fun, because you kind of have to spin them around and then poke them in their, like, midsection. So there's more strategy here than there was in, like, Ocarina of Time. You also get the beetle, which is a great item we haven't seen before, where you can shoot this remote-controlled little flying beetle around, and anything it collects, it'll bring back to you. You can use it to cut down enemies, you can use it to cut ropes. There's a ton of different uses for this thing. It's fun to use. It's a nice addition to the kind of core Zelda items. This is also where we get introduced to the changes to the boss key system. Instead of just getting a key that is larger than the other keys, you kind of get this object which you have to rotate and then insert into the door. Like, it doesn't really change anything about how you enter the boss room other than you having to rotate a little thing. But it's a nice little bit of flavor that helps distinguish this game from the other games. And the boss fight here is actually, I think, maybe one of the best first boss fights in a Zelda game, because you are facing kind of the main antagonist of the game, Girahim. He is, I love this character. He's like the front man of a Duran Duran cover band turned demon lord. And he's always just like mincing and like licking his lips really creepily. And he's got the hair and the robes and everything. And this boss fight is actually really interesting because he doesn't really attack you much. You are just this is kind of where the game is teaching you how to use the motion control combat in an actual combat scenario. Because he will kind of guide you with his hand, and if you attack his hand, he will grab your sword, and you have to grab it back. So it kind of teaches you to avoid that area and how to attack around something like that. And then during the second portion of the boss fight, he pulls out a sword, and you're actually having this sword fight. And it's a ton of fun, and it's challenging and exciting, and it doesn't feel like previous boss fights in the Zelda series, which are usually kind of rote, and you just use the item you picked up in the dungeon against the boss to defeat them. You're not using the beetle here, all you're using is your sword skills. And it's a really cool segment of this game. Your reward, though, for completing the dungeon is really underwhelming, because all you're getting is the map to the next area you have to go to. You know, in Ocarina of Time, you had, like, I'm getting these stones, and these stones are going to unlock the Master Sword. That's really cool. In this game, it's like, oh, Zelda's not here, guess we'll go to the next one. And here's a map to get there. But then you're off to, of course, the fire area, which is always the second area. This is where you start to use the bombs a lot more. There's enemies where you have to roll bombs into their shells to defeat them. There's also this minigame called Thrill Digger, which is basically Minesweeper, and I spent like 45 minutes playing it because it's fun. This area feels like a mini dungeon because it has puzzles to solve, it has enemies to defeat, and it's all in the service of getting you to the actual dungeon. So it feels much more lively and well crafted than the usual lead up to a Zelda dungeon. Once you get to the dungeon, it introduces some really cool new ideas. You get to roll on this giant ball. The worry, of course, would be that you would have to use the motion controls to kind of like steer yourself on the ball, kind of like in Mario Galaxy. But no, you can just use the nunchuck, the analog controls, and you're fine. It's awesome. I'm so glad they went with that because it makes it a lot of fun to use instead of a chore. This dungeon feels very natural. It always feels like you're making progress towards something. It kind of highlights how in this game the dungeon design is very traditional. Twilight Princess did some things where it kind of mixed up the dungeon structure. It gave you areas that were very not dungeon-like, like a mansion. This game, you are going into dungeons, and they are dungeony, they are Zelda dungeons. You get the dungeon map and the boss key, and you go to the door. The boss here is kind of interesting. You're kind of pushing and pulling up this ramp. It's kind of introducing concepts that'll be used later in the game. You use the bombs a lot. This is kind of a letdown after the first boss fight, but it can't just be fighting Girahim over and over again. I understand that. So, and then your third and final area is the desert, and I think this is one of the coolest and most interesting areas in a Zelda game, because what this area is the present version of something that used to be vibrant and full of life, and you're kind of experiencing it after the fall, where everything's been replaced by desert. But what it has is these little stones you can strike. If you strike one of the stones, they're called time shift stones, the area around the stone actually reverts to its past version. So there are so many cool concepts and puzzles that involve traveling between the present and the past within a localized area, and they make excellent use of it. It looks fantastic because you got like this overflow of color within this kind of dreary desert. You're also interacting with these robots that only exist in the past, and they are an extremely interesting idea for a robot design because they don't look like robots. They look very natural. They look very like carved out of stone. This whole area, I just love it. This is where Skyward Sword kind of comes into its own as an interesting take on the Zelda series for me. Really cool. But the issue I run into is when you get to the dungeon in this area, and it's like, hold on, before you get into this dungeon, you have to go charge 3 stations. And this is a grim portent of what this game will become very shortly. But for now, you just have to go to 3 stations, charge them up. What this area does at this point is actually really, really interesting, which is that the robot updates your map to the past version. So there's this quicksand, and what you can do is run along paths that existed in the past that you can't see in the present. And you can set markers for yourself on the map, so you're kind of running along past highways, you know. It's just this really interesting novel idea, and it leads you to the mining facility, which is the dungeon of this area. And what the item that this area introduces is called the Gust Bellows, and I have thoughts on the Gust Bellows because it is so much fun to go through a room and like blow away all the dust and everything. It's just like, that's like intrinsically satisfying. But a lot of the puzzles that use the Gust Bellows just kind of have you standing in one place and waiting for something to happen while you blow on it. And that's very disappointing because there's so many cool uses they could have done with the Gust Bellows. They don't make good on a lot of that. Otherwise, there's really good use of the time shift stones here in this dungeon. There's this really, really cool room where they do make good on the Gust Bellows because there is a spike maze hidden in the sand, and so you have to go through and clear away all the sand while you're navigating this maze, and it's this really cool concept, and it's not something you would see in other games. The boss fight is also really cool. It's this giant scorpion that burrows under the sand, and you have to uncover him with Gust Bellows. Every enemy in this game is kind of built on striking in the middle of a barrier. So each claw is like a barrier, and you have to strike through where the claw isn't at his like eyes. It's really cool. So then you've kind of completed your task and you've reunited with Zelda, but she has to go to the past, which is dumb. But you do reunite with Groose, and that's fun because he has kind of a change of character. It's cute. So what you're doing now is you're trying to get to the past to help Zelda. This is where delayed gratification starts to rear its ugly head. Let me take you back to Ocarina of Time. Once you got the 3 stones, you put them in the thing, and then you get the sword, and then you have the Master Sword, and then things happen, and all of a sudden you're an adult, and it's this whole new world to explore. And there's not a lot of like going places. You don't have to do any chores. You have the stones. Here you go. I have the sword. In this game, after you beat the first 3 dungeons, it just kind of layers on stupid things for you to do. Because in order to go into the past, you have to have the Master Sword, which means you have to go forge your sword in 3 sacred fires. And the 3 sacred fires are in the same places where you just were. They're in the desert, they're in the volcano, they're in the forest. So the game at this point kind of becomes a treadmill of running through these same 3 areas over and over, accomplishing different goals. And that's very frustrating. They do new things in each area. It's not like you're doing the exact same things over and over again. But as a player, it's very frustrating because it feels like you are being led along and not accomplishing anything. They do introduce at this point the musical instrument of the game, the harp. I actually really like how the harp is used in the game. You know, it takes away a lot of the control you had with like the ocarina where you could actually play different notes. But the music you play is very Fee will come out of the sword and sing along with your playing in order to unlock things. And these moments are just like beautiful because the music just kind of swells around you and there's visual representations of the music, and Fee is singing and she's got like this cool chirpy robot voice. Speaking of which, the music, I guess it goes without saying, but the music in this game is all excellent through the whole game. Much better than Twilight Princess, I thought, which had very too subtle, like too ambient styled of music. This is much more recognizably Zelda music, and it's very effective. So at this point, you have to fight the Imprisoned, which is this big, stupid-looking thing that comes out of the ground. It's got wiggly toes, and you just have to fight the wiggly toes. Everything about this, from the design of the character to what you are doing to the area you are fighting in, it just feels extremely uninspired and dull, and it doesn't feel like dangerous because it looks so stupid. It's repetitive. I hate this section. But you do it, and then you go forge your sword. This is also where you are introduced to this character who is one of the robots from the desert, but he is like your pack mule, and he has an attitude, and he doesn't like you, but he likes Fee, and he like calls you short pants and stuff, and it's dumb. I don't like this character. This is just a bad section of the game. This doesn't feel like firing on all cylinders. One thing I do like they do during the section is when they incorporate Skyloft into this legend that is unfolding, because you open up this tower that's in Skyloft and it actually points you to this kind of temple that you have to use to learn songs. That's a really cool concept because it makes it feel like Skyloft is part of this greater whole. This is also the introduction of the Silent Realm, which is, I think, one of the best things in this game. And what it basically is a stealth minigame. And I know what you're thinking, but this is actually really good because it takes the Twilight Princess concept where you had to capture all the little light orbs, and what it does is it turns it into this challenging, like, stealth obstacle course where time is constantly ticking down, and if it does, then all these enemies come for you, and it's very, like, exciting. It feels like an adrenaline rush every time. It's just extremely well crafted. Everything feels like they had a vision for this part of the game and they delivered on it. And it takes strategy. Like, you have to pass over easy to collect little orbs so that you can come back later when you have more time. It feels like something you can get better at. It's a really cool. And it looks cool, it sounds cool, everything about this I loved it. Here you go back to the woods as you revisit each of these areas, and you have to start swimming. The swimming controls are very poor. I don't like how they handled swimming in this game. It feels really clunky. You kind of have to steer yourself with the Wii Remote, which, if you've ever used a Wii Remote before, you know that's not the most tactile or accurate way to steer a character and to saddle you in these stupid underwater sections with these terrible controls is really not fun at all. You do have a little spinny thing you can do, but it's hard to line it up right. But the Zora designs are actually really cool. These aren't Zora, they're kind of a primordial version of the Zora. It's a cool take on those characters, because I guess we have these on one end, bird people on the other, and then we got the fish people in the middle. It's a cool progression. And then it kind of throws you back into the forest dungeon for a very poorly justified section where you have to go get holy water for this dragon so that she will lead you to the sacred fire to forge your sword. But the holy water is at the very end of the dungeon you just beat, so you have to go back to the forest dungeon and kind of go through it again. And then there's not really a boss fight at the end, it's just 3 enemies you have to fight, and then you bring it back to her. She's like, okay, you did it. And then you go to the actual temple. But the actual dungeon, the ancient Cistern, is my favorite in the game. is this gorgeous, it's like the centrally focused dungeon where you're always working around this giant statue, and it looks fantastic. It's got this very Eastern imagery going on. The music is great. You're kind of solving these cool puzzles. You get a whip, and the whip is a ton of fun to use because it uses the motion controls really well. You can kind of use it to swing. You can use it to flip lily pads. It's just really... This dungeon was kind of my favorite part of the game. It was just pure Zelda fun for like an hour. And the boss at the end is fantastic. One of my favorite bosses in any Zelda game. He's got all these swords, and you can use the swords against him, and it's this, like, you know, soulless machine that's only designed to kill Link with swords. It's just really good. And you go to hell at one point. You, like, climb a rope down to hell, and then you're in hell, and then you climb the rope back up, because there's, like, it's so cool. I love it. And then from there, you go to the Sandship, which is also a really, really cool area in the game. Like, these areas, they're reusing them, but they're reusing them in really cool and interesting ways. So it does feel like a chore, but only conceptually. Actually going through these areas again is actually really interesting. So the Sandship, you're back in the desert, but you're actually driving around in a boat with a little robot pirate. And there's a time shift stone on the boat. So everywhere you go is water, because this used to be an ocean. So you're like swimming around in this ocean that doesn't exist anymore. And it's such a cool concept. And I can't help but love this game, because it gives me experiences like this. It's fantastic. And then you're like on a pirate ship in this, you know, it's like this invisible pirate ship that doesn't exist anymore, and it's his old crew. He gets the crew back together. You like go to his cabin, and he's got pictures of his crew, and he's all happy. Oh, it's so cool. And then, like, the dungeon itself is this pirate ship. So you're, like, actually exploring this ancient robot pirate ship. And that's such a cool idea. And you, like, fight the robot pirate captain on, like, the gangplanks. And he's like, it's just, this is a really cool thing. And it's something, you should play Skyward Sword just to experience things like this. But then, there's the worst part of the game, which is, you have to... So there's these doors, right? And you have to get water into the door. Because there's like a frog, and he's thirsty, and if you put water into him, then the fire shuts off, and you can go through the doorway. Which, you know, doesn't make any sense, but... So there's this bigger frog you get to, and it's like, how are we going to get water to this frog? So what you have to do is go back to the dragon lady, because she's got like this big tank. And she's like, okay, fine, take the tank. So then you have to call down the robot buddy. And the robot buddy comes and he grabs the tank for you, and it's full of water. Then you have to go back to the volcano. But instead of just going straight to the thing, he's like, oops, we landed at the bottom. So now you have to escort this stupid robot who makes fun of you all the time. And you hate him. And he takes you, and you have to escort him to the top of the mountain again, which you've done like 3 times, because you've already been here. And then it's like, and then it's not even explained right, because he's like, don't let me get hit, because you're escorting me, but then he can get hit, and it doesn't matter. But there's like more enemies, and then you have to like fight him on these little walkways, so you keep falling off, and the game like glitches out. And this is like the worst part of the entire game, and it's so stupid. Ugh. It really doesn't get any better from here, so if you're at home playing and you get to this point, you can quit. I'll just tell you what happens at the end of the game. So what happens is, you go through, and then you get your sword better, and then you fight the bad guy at the end, and you beat him. But before you do that, you have to come back and fight the imprisoned like 3 more times, and it's the same, except then he has arms, and the arms don't actually like do anything in the fight. He just has like these sleepwalking arms out in front of him, and that's stupid. Okay, so you get your sword forged, but I will stop being irreverent for a second, because there is actually a cutscene here that I think is extremely affecting and good and well designed. Because what happens is, you reunite with Zelda after all this time, and it's a sweet, you know, the music's playing and it's very emotional, but what they do here is actually really interesting from a narrative perspective, and from the perspective of someone who has played the Zelda games before. Because what Zelda says is, I basically use you as a tool because it is your destiny to come after me, and it's what you do. And it's kind of like this meta commentary on these games, which is you're always chasing Zelda for no real reason. And that's what you've done in this game so far. And then she basically tells you to your face, yeah, I made you do that because I needed you to for my own ends. And that is such a cool twist on the Zelda concept, like the concept of the games, and I love it. And then she's like, I have to seal myself away until, you know, the end of the game, basically, which always seems to happen, but there you go. Just really cool. I loved the direction that cutscene took, because it's not what you expect. This also introduces this time gate, which is very poorly implemented because past games in the series have let you travel between time periods. This one, you just kind of end up back in the temple where it's at, and you can't really leave the temple. It's kind of hard to know even which time period you're in. It basically just exists for narrative purposes, so you can go back and forth in time within this temple to chat with Zelda or Impa, her bodyguard. I wish they had used this better, or even let you explore, you know, because it's interesting because you're hearing about Hylia, or, you know, the Earth back when, and you're able to go back there, but they won't actually let you out. They won't let you explore the world. It's disappointing, but and then you have to go fight like this giant space whale parasite, whatever. Like, there's a section, and the developers were like, we wanted you to fight on a Loftwing because you have Loftwings in this game, but you're just kind of like spinning at these little parasite things. I always imagine in my head when I'm doing this, like, you could have this awesome scene where you're like flying along this giant space whale and like dashing in and out of stuff and making it cool, but instead it's just like this slow moving whale that isn't even that big, and you just kind of spin at it a couple times and say, okay. And then you're like, oh my god, I finally accomplished my mission. But no, you didn't, because you have to learn 3 parts of the song so that you can find out where the Triforce is. So you have to go back to the same 3 areas and do stuff again. The volcano stuff is really, really, really stupid. They steal all your items, and then it's like the stealth section, but it's not a very good stealth section because you don't have any idea where the enemies are or how far they can see or anything. So you just kind of run around a corner and, oh no, there was a bad guy there, and then you have to start over. It's like, ugh, not a good section. But the forest section is actually really interesting. The entire area becomes flooded, and you have to go find these little musical tadpoles. And that sounds dumb, but it's actually a ton of fun to track them down, and they give you more oxygen, so you can kind of go indefinitely as long as you're always collecting these things. This also really shows off the game's art style, which I haven't talked about at all. This game has kind of an impressionist feel to it. It's not as overstated as it could be. It's actually pretty subtle in most cases, but when you get to these wide open spots, you really get a sense for how well all the elements of the art style kind of blend together. One thing I will say is they don't use this art style enough, because a lot of the areas you go to are very barren or dingy, and they don't really exploit this art style to the extent that it feels like they should. But this area in particular is beautiful, and it really showcases what this could be used for in the future. I guess they're not going to do that because they've kind of abandoned this art style, but I wish there had been a follow-up with the same style, because it could have been, if it looked anything like this area, a game like that could have been absolutely gorgeous. But what can you do? And then they kind of top off everything with one final dungeon, one final spirit trial, which takes place in Skyloft, which is a really cool idea. Kind of running around this area that you've become accustomed to. It's always bright and friendly, and now it's this like grueling obstacle course. It's really cool. And then the final dungeon has this fantastic design to it where it is 8 rooms basically, and it's one of those like sliding puzzles, but you can slide the rooms. So you have to manipulate the dungeon itself in order to make your way to the 3 pieces of the Triforce. And it's also really cool because there are actual pieces of the Triforce in these rooms, and you walk up to them and you collect them. And as someone who always had kind of a vague understanding of what the Triforce was, this is a really cool way to introduce this into the canon of Zelda games. Because you collect them all and you're like, yes, I did it! I got the Triforce! And then there's this nice little like psych out ending where it's like, oh, Zelda, I love you! Link, I love you! Blah, 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 blah. And Groose is there and he's all happy because he's like had this complete change of character and he's like, he wants to help people and it's all nice. And then it's like, oh yeah, I forgot, there's like a bad guy in this game, and then the bad guy shows up and steals Zelda, and then there's this kind of cool section where you're running down and he's throwing waves of enemies at you, and it's kind of impressive, and it's fun, because you're just like wailing through all these bad guys. My shield broke during this part, which made it kind of hard during the last boss fight. I had to go get a different shield eventually. That's another thing, your shields can break. I've talked too much about it, so... the last boss fight with Girahim is... It kind of mixes up the other boss fights with him in a cool way because he's kind of become a demon lord and he's all angry. He's basically turning into a sword, which is a really cool concept because he is the counterpoint of Feet, who is your sword. So you kind of see the same design concepts reflected in these two characters. And he kind of gradually becomes darker and more metallic, and it's really cool. And then he summons, you know, Demise, the demon god, and he grabs a sword out of Girahim, and then you fight him in like the sky, and this whole section is really cool. From a like story standpoint, it's really not that interesting. It's like, I am all powerful and I hate you, let's fight. And then you fight and you beat him, goes your Zelda Link. And then the last kind of interesting thing this game does is establish why this keeps happening. And he basically says, I will haunt you forever. All your descendants are destined to fight me. And that kind of helps explain this recurring, like, Ganondorf. It's all because of this one encounter that's kind of trickling down through the generations. And that's kind of cool. Other than that, it's really not an interesting character at all. They've done better villains in the past. This is just kind of, you know, Dragon Ball Z Ganondorf fighting you with a sword. And then you beat the game, and they don't really do anything interesting with the end of the game. Except that Zelda says she will stay on the Earth, and that's kind of the establishment of Hyrule. That's how we move from Skyloft to Hyrule. There you go. So all in all, this game is fascinating, and it's exactly the kind of Zelda game that I had asked for, which is one that takes Zelda and looks at its core components, it looks at every aspect of it, and it says, why is this like this and how can we change it? And it does that just enough to make it one of my favorite Zelda games. There are definitely parts of this game that are frustrating from a structural standpoint, from a gameplay standpoint, but overall, this was a very positive experience for me, and I think they accomplished a lot of the goals they set for themselves in ways that past games haven't felt like.